Hello and welcome to Piece of the Podcast, where we'll work on outlining the intersection of our personal and political work.
Here, we want to create a place to talk about how our relationships with ourselves and our communities are inherently political, integrate the knowledge we have received and continue to receive, and speak to and dream of justice, love, and community.
Carson, who are you?
Hi, I'm Carson, they, them. I'm dedicated to making space to question our systems and trying to build resilience, community care, and solidarity into the everyday.
I'm Ella, also they, them, and I'm a bubbly and radically kind intimacy activist. I teach consent as a tool for political revolution as a way to counter the capitalist values we have internalized.
Great. And what are we going to be talking about today?
So we did a little silly goof in typical Carson Ella style. We recorded an entire podcast that was looking at conflict and accountability through the lens of white supremacy culture. And it is beautiful and amazing, and we can't wait to share that with you. However, we realized we had gone a little too far into the deep end and needed a little bit more background information, more foundation, making sure that everyone can come along with us as we go through this journey.
Exactly, because we can talk about white supremacy culture and kind of interpersonal relationships, but we didn't really talk about like what are the actual effects of white supremacy culture in kind of just like real terms, like material ways, how whiteness as a category is, as we'll talk about later, violent to everyone, not just to people who are not white.
Yes. And so if you happen to be watching the video version of this podcast and you see our outfits changing all the time, we're making a little mishmash, and it will come to you in a coherent way that makes sense. Trust.
Yes.
So what are we going to be talking about today, Carson?
So today we're going to talk about kind of how whiteness and whiteness as a category, white supremacy culture, is not just dehumanizing towards people who are not white, but also dehumanizing towards white people, creates like material, like very material and real violence for basically anyone of the global majority, also if you're living in the global north, but also creates like spiritual problems for white people. And I use spiritual here in a truly appropriative way. I'm talking about it in like the really like what does it mean for us to be people and what does it mean for us to exist in the world kind of way.
Yeah, I think spirituality is a term that I also run away from in many ways. When I first got started, I was advertising myself as community healing with Ella because I saw the impact that having a community of like people who love me unconditionally had on all of these attachment wounds that I was having. And I felt like the love of other people was just so comfy, cozy, and beautiful. And I was like, community healing. And I got so much feedback that I was creating spaces that people didn't want to attend because they were too woo-woo, too spiritual, and it had such negative connotations. And I think that's such a shame. But I think that spirituality is a really important part in society in terms of what are your morals, what are your values, and how do you want to live in the world in alignment with those, and not how much does something cost. How much money does it cost? How much time does it cost? But what are your morals and values and how do you live them? That kind of spirituality.
And we will move on to talk about how whiteness has actually affected also for white people our connection to spirituality right after we do a quick little origins of whiteness segment.
Yes. So for that, I actually found some excerpts from the White Supremacy website. And I was wondering if you, Carson, could read the one titled A Brief Historical Context.
Of course. As early settlers came to what would become the U.S. from Europe, those in leaderships were male and Christian. They did not identify as white. They identified with their ethnic, national, and or religious roots. They were English, French, Dutch, and they were Protestant, Catholic, Puritan. They came with the desire to create a new world where they could profit and prosper. But once here, they faced a big problem. These ruling class elite and their families were outnumbered by the indigenous people whose lives and land they were stealing, and the Africans who they forcibly kidnapped for enslavement and forced labor. Because the ruling elite were outnumbered, they had to persuade newly arriving immigrants from Europe to cast aside their ethnic, national, and or religious differences into a solidarity that could meet the challenge. And so they created the category of white and consolidated the idea of white supremacy as a way to organize these very different immigrants into a singular and unifying racial category. They did this by requiring them to disconnect from their ethnic and national identities in order to gain access to the material, emotional, physical, intellectual, and spiritual benefits of a whiteness designed specifically and intentionally to pit them against and place them above indigenous and enslaved peoples.
Thank you.
So this is like when we're talking about this, right? This is like where does it originate? So where does like the category of white originate? And how was it used and instrumentalized against the indigenous and enslaved people? I think we have like a lot of historical knowledge on how this category, which in itself, and this is what I think is so interesting about whiteness, like doesn't have a shared culture. So like white people do not necessarily have shared culture in the sense of my culture in the Netherlands, for example, like Dutch culture is very different from French culture. I mean, it might be kind of similar to German culture, I guess, but like there are actually quite a lot of differences between the different kind of like, I'm going to put this in quotation marks, right? Because like ethnicity also like a changed the way that we use the word ethnicity, but like the different ethnicities of Europe. So we see that it's like actually in itself kind of a hollow category, right? From this historical background.
Yeah, it's also like by very definition a disavowal of your ancestors, of your land, of your cultural context, and giving all of that up so that you can be part of a elite power majority. And majority is also in quotation marks here because it was literally founded on the scarcity mindset of, oh crap, we want to hoard all the power, but we don't have the people to back it up. So how can we kind of get other people to disavow where they came from, what their cultural context is? The like, my family used to live in Hungary, and I always think of those beautiful embroidery and all the different ways that they adorn themselves with color and beauty and intricate designs, and how that had to just kind of be given up because it was this cultural marker of, oh, you are Hungarian. And now if we skip forward to the present day, we identify as minimalist, not wearing color, all these different bland ways of like one size fits all standard cookie cutter human being is kind of the goal of whiteness now.
Yeah, and I think like this is again what we see with the origin, right? Like when we look at the origin of whiteness, like this idea that it's a persuading force to, again, I'm going to quote, persuade newly arriving immigrants from Europe to cast aside their ethnic, national, and or religious differences. So basically, whiteness acts as a homogenizing force. And in that, exactly what you're saying about, for example, these traditional dresses from the different cultures, they're markers of difference, right? And in those markers of difference, like, again, they bring up the opportunity to have like conflicting needs or to have difference in solidarity within the category of white, and therefore not able to kind of create this quote unquote majority that was being sought for. And I think like this brings us really nicely into like, okay, so what is white supremacy culture then? Because like this is, we're talking about a little bit about the origin of whiteness. And of course, like it's much more complicated than this. But in this podcast, we specifically want to focus on like white supremacy culture. And so I think we have a quote on white supremacy culture.
Culture reflects the beliefs, values, norms, and standards of a group, a community, a town, a state, and nation. White supremacy culture is the widespread ideology baked into the beliefs, values, norms, and standards of our groups, our communities, our towns, our states, our nation, teaching us both overtly and covertly that whiteness holds value. Whiteness is value. So, going into white supremacy culture, Tema Okun's website outlines 15 characteristics of white supremacy culture. And these outline cultural norms, quoting again, that uphold white supremacy in organizations and society, make them harder to challenge because they're often seen as just the way things are. These characteristics are not meant to describe all white people. They are meant to describe the norms of a white middle class and owning class culture, a culture we are all required to navigate regardless of our multiple identities.
Okay, so an interesting thing about the concept of white, middle, and owning class values is like, of course, when the like with the introduction of like a class-based system in the US after settlement, you had only white people in the middle and owning class, right? Which is why we call it white supremacy culture, because it's based on that. Now, of course, we have middle and owning class, people of color, Black people, Indigenous folks, right? And I think like an interesting thing about this, and this is also why we were talking about kind of like the importance of confronting white supremacy culture in any culture in the West, is because we're all going to be reproducing these things while we're embedded in this class system and while we have a middle or owning class consciousness. I think like that's, for me, that's one of the main intersections of kind of like class theory and racial justice theory, is to remember that like it's intertwined, and that those kind of characteristics of white supremacy culture can be embodied by everyone, and that doesn't mean that it's not white supremacy culture, and that this has an inherent like class basis in it as well, because it's talking about middle and owning class norms, and that the moment that we're embedded within those class structures, that we are going to be reproducing parts of this.
Quote from the website: white supremacy culture would have us believe that we can and should pinpoint our motivations or actions to determine if they are based on our racism, those of us who are white, or some other aspect of our personality. The idea seems to be that if we prove our perfectionism isn't motivated by racism, then it's all right, when in fact our perfectionism is never all right. Thank goodness our commitment to our own growth and development as anti-racist white people helps us to see the ways in which our internalizations of superiority warp our relationships, not just with BIPOC people and communities, but with other white people and with ourselves. This is the magic of racial justice work. Our commitment to racial justice is a healing practice for all aspects of our lives. Big deep breath.
Okay, so now that we've done the cliff notes of kind of the origins of whiteness, as in it's obviously super, super simplified, there's much more nuance, there's much more history here, but just to kind of give a brief historical context for what we're going to be talking about, we're coming back to our main thesis, inspired by Tema Okun from whitesupremacyculture.info. Our commitment to racial justice is a healing practice for all aspects of our lives.
Juicy.
Exactly. All right. What do you think, Ella?
When you first called me about having to re-record this podcast and talk about dehumanization, the first like thing that popped into my brain was in like middle school or high school when I was studying psychology. There was this one study. They did this in like MRI machines. So I think they were just showing people images, and it said if they would show pictures of objects, certain parts of the brain lit up. And if it's like this initial processing where you're like, what is that? Is it a car? Is it a person? Whatever. And if it's a person, a second part of the brain lights up as well. And that is triggering the response of what is this person feeling? What is this person internal monologue? What are they thinking and feeling right now? And it's a very empathetic response. And we get that with human beings. We have that with animals. We have that with cartoons where you're like, oh, wow, that square is like desperately trying to chase after that circle. And we like anthropomorphize everything often. But when it comes to people who are unhoused, that part of the brain doesn't light up. So that section of, is this a human being? What is that person feeling right now? How are they operating in the world? We don't have access to that in the moment. And so I did some research before I just started blabbing about this on a podcast. And I have some really interesting quotes from an article that I would like to share with you. The question was, okay, they didn't live in London, the interviewer, and now they are in London. And they're like, I was struck by how many people are living on the streets. If I were here every day, would my mind eventually switch to self-protection mode? Because the researcher was saying, we do this for self-protection, that it's too hard to be empathetic all the time. So the researcher said, yes, if you lived here, it would be impossible for you to be empathetic constantly. Being empathic takes a toll on us, right? It requires us to resonate with someone's suffering, and that can be very unpleasant. It would be very difficult for you to get through the day if you didn't somehow regulate that response. So to regulate it, you shut it down before it gets going. It goes on to say, we've done a lot of work recently looking at this process in other contexts. For instance, medical professionals see a lot of suffering. It turns out they do something similar so that they don't burn out and they can continue to attend to people's needs. They look at people almost as broken machines rather than humans, because otherwise it triggers an overwhelming empathic response. You see the same thing with military personnel. As a starter, what feelings come up when you hear that quote, Carson?
Yeah, like I think I don't know. I think it makes me mostly feel really sad, and it also makes me feel really angry because like the fact that we have to do this in order to like be able to survive in this world, which is so full of violence, we have to be able to shut down our empathic response to other people. That's something that I think is a very intense thing to realize. No, it's really like, and I say this quite often, I say like, we were not made to live in a world where so much violence is so close to the surface and we're confronted with it all of the time.
I think just as a response to that, it says like they look at people almost as broken machines because it's just too intense to see the suffering.
Yeah.
If you really were to look around you and see what our society looks like right now, and you stripped away everything and you saw outright the cost of colonization, what our history actually looks like from a lens that isn't from the victor of like, oh, the golden age of Dutch colonialism and our Indies and how amazing it was, but really the suffering and violence that it took to build the society that we are currently profiting off of. I think if you stripped everything away and you really truly looked at it and felt it in your body, it would be way too overwhelming.
Yeah.
To really grapple with that.
So I think that that's the point, right? Like in this kind of like suppression of the empathy response, we're able to live in this world where certain things are not seen. And I think one of the things that does, and why I think like this dehumanization or like this, it's like an objectification, right, is important to talk about during a conversation about white supremacy, is because that's what happens under white supremacy to people of color, people of the global majority, Black, Indigenous, everyone who is not designated like the consistent marker of white, like me, like you, like we're always white.
I think why I wanted to start with this homelessness or like houseless, what's the right term? Is there a right term? Houseless
I'm more
people?
interested in like helping people than I am in naming it correctly, I think.
Me too, but it's a podcast and we've been called out on our language before, so I thought I'd be mindful of it. But I think that this is something that is very relatable, especially living in Berlin.
Yeah.
When you walk down the street, you're going to encounter a lot of people living on the streets and they're going to be asking you for a lot of money. Like there's just a constant back and forth, and it's a very tangible grasp where I'm like, oh, okay, have you, listener, right now, ever walked down the street, saw an unhoused person and just thought, okay, I'm not going to make eye contact. I'm going to go away. I don't want them to like ask me for money. I don't have any money right now. Mm-hmm. And it's like, it's not a feeling of, oh, this is a person who's had a lot of very uncomfortable, unfortunate circumstances that have led to them being on the street. And homelessness can happen to anyone. Like it is not some unique moral failing. And in the article that I am pulling from, they were also talking about in Japan, they had so many natural disasters that most people know someone who was homeless at some point in their life. It is a very common thing that happened because of climate change. Whereas, and I quote, in Western cultures, we tend to have a belief that you get what you work for. This idea that there are all these opportunities available, and if you are destitute, you've something to do with it. But homelessness could happen to any of us. Mm-hmm. I think that that's really important to kind of see that we really need to dehumanize others and see them as unworthy in order to make sense of this world. We have to have some other logic around it. And they also looked into how there's a lot of abuse happening to homeless people in the UK. And he addressed it and said, it's because if you're not considering someone suffering, then there's no suffering when you abuse someone. You can beat up an object as much as you like, and you're seeing people as objects. And I think that if you really extrapolate this idea where it's like, oh yeah, when you think of Africa, it's always these poor Africans living in some desert who have no access to food and water, and we need to go and do this humanitarian crisis to help them. And it's always dehumanizing others, saying, oh, look at Muslim people wear different dress than us and they are so different. And all of this difference is a way of devaluing them and not seeing them as fully fledged human beings, because
Mm-hmm.
we wouldn't be able to comprehend the amount of suffering that we are inflicting upon them
Mm-hmm.
in this way. And I think that that is then necessary to do to ourselves, because we are also living under the system and we are also in so much pain and in these horrible conditions that we need to dehumanize ourselves to not fully realize how bad it is.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think at the end of the day, and this is why I like this thesis, like doing this racial justice work is healing work for all aspects of our lives, is because, like, to dehumanize another person, you are dehumanizing yourself, right? To like not recognize like the humanity of another person is to not recognize like the humanity that also exists in yourself. And I think that this is like a really important thing for me, is I feel like, and this is why I talk about like a spiritual emptiness, because if we look at like a way of being in the world that is like really based off of, okay, like community, love, justice, we can't be dehumanizing people under that model. And so we are like in a betrayal of our own self, our own humanity, our own values of justice, our own values of like love when we participate in white supremacy culture, basically, right? Because we're doing that to someone else. I found a really, really nice article, which was written by a white Brazilian woman. And it's called The Role of White People in the Fight Against Racism. And what I really liked about it was it really tried to construct like a critical whiteness and to examine like, okay, so what does it actually mean as white people to be anti-racist? And not from like this point of view of like, oh, I'm just always checking my privilege, because I don't know how well that works at the end of the day if we're just feeling like a bit guilty all the time, or we're just trying to be good white people all the time. I have a quote on that also for later, actually. But on like constructing and why this is about like creating a shared humanity. So she says, the notion that I consider fundamental to the construction of an effectively democratic society is reciprocal recognition. So I really like this concept of reciprocal recognition.
Mm-hmm.
That is, someone who recognizes themselves and others as deserving of dignity, rights, knowledge, social projects, and life. Someone who evolves based on the understanding of their incompleteness and of alterity in the sense of the capacity to recognize themselves in interdependent relationships with others and with the environment. And I think that that's where I want to go, right? When I talk about being anti-racist, when I talk about betraying white culture, when I talk about like white traitorship, this is like what I'm talking about. It's actually not so much about like whiteness or blackness per se. It's actually more about recognizing our interconnectedness with other people. And yes, that means being able to recognize patterns of domination. That means being able to recognize like when we speak from a place of privilege, or when we speak from, yeah, places that we actually don't know about, maybe. But what it actually mostly is about is recognize the humanity in ourselves and in the other person. And I found a really nice quote from a professor of linguistics on white fragility. I really like this concept because I think like white fragility and also the book Me and White Supremacy, I think that they can have a counterproductive effect. And so what this linguist, John McWhorter, says is, when I say that White Fragility is a racist book, what I mean is that it does not allow Black people to be full human beings, because full human beings deal with the imperfections of life. And I really like that, because I think that that's really like this place where, you know, we start getting into, what does it mean to be together in a space? What does it mean to share a space? Does it mean that we always say the right thing? Does it mean that we are always like terrified to make a mistake because we might trigger someone's response? Or is it actually about learning about ourselves and learning also how to be in spaces together, right? In shared spaces, and have space for mistakes, and learn as white people to receive feedback, and as people of color to give us feedback, and to be able to do that, and that we deal with those complexities together, right?
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah, when I was doing my thesis research for my master's, which was specifically on how is institutional power enacted to stop change from happening and like social progress through the lens of this group of student activists who were discussing Black Lives Matter and anti-racist actions to be done at the university. And one teacher was an anthropology professor, was like, I'm going to lead a book club where we are going to read Me and White Supremacy. And I immediately was like, I don't know how I feel about this. But he started each book club with a whole moment saying, I'm so sorry that I, as a white man, take up so much space, and would apologize for taking up space for like 10 minutes into the book club meeting. And I was just like, we've done this every week. Can you stop? And then it was this whole book on, okay, think about yourself and your ideas of what racism is. How do you internalize these racist thoughts? If you were to get onto a bus, would you rather sit next to the white person or the black person? And then it was like, be real. You would sit next to the white person because that would make you feel more safe. And it's like, I understand why it's really important to sit and reflect and figure out what your role is in this. But when we're talking about racism, it is the structures in society that continuously disenfranchise certain people to give all of the power and resources and wealth to another group. And it is very hard through your individual behavior to change that entire structure. But one of the characteristics of white supremacy culture from the Tema Okun website is individualism and the thought that you alone have such a impact on the world and can do so much. But it's this idea that in order to not be racist, you need to police your own thoughts and think about where they come from. What are you going to do with that? Where is that going to go? How is that going to make some kind of effect in the world? Emma Dabiri.
Exactly. We also have been wanting to plug Emma Dabiri. We're going to plug Emma Dabiri probably throughout this episode.
We plugged her in our intro episode.
I love Emma Dabiri.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so like this actually reminds me of another quote of the role of white people in the fight against racism, which is basically saying like it's really important for white people to be involved in this struggle. And I think this is a nice example, Ella, that you gave at some point. Like it's just like the role of Jewish people in the struggle for a free Palestine, right? Because we need to recognize that like as like the oppressor category, which is, complex. It's really important that we are active participants in this and that we have conversations about racism and we have conversations about white supremacy and that we are also like actively thinking and creating new thoughts about this. And so what's said in this article is there's another pitfall of whiteness, falling into a comfortable, passive, and accommodated place, protected from conflict, believing that only Black and Indigenous people can talk about how to face racism. It is fundamental to build spaces of negotiation and political trust based on principles jointly agreed on so that we may learn to build political strategies along with Black and Indigenous people. And this is kind of like what I have seen happen before in the anti-racist space, but also just like in general, like I had this super, super strongly. I was just like, I know about racism, but like I'm not allowed to form a critical opinion about it. I'm not allowed to think about it. I am just allowed to like regurgitate the material that has been given to me by authors of color, and also like they are unquestionably right? Basically, like unless they're like very, very blatantly right wing, I just swallow what they have to say and I don't actually critique it. Like, so we can understand like, oh, maybe is this the political strategy that we want to use? But we don't have spaces where we've built that trust, where we're able to negotiate and where we're able to have open conversations about this. And for me, it took like one of my friends to be like, you're allowed to have an opinion on racism. And with him, I was able to develop like a very strong and deep negotiation of like, how do we talk about these things? How do we navigate these things? How do we move through these things? And that's because we built that on a really strong foundation of trust of like, we are both here working for a specific political project. We were working specifically like on decolonization. We were working on like bringing climate justice more into the forefront, like talking about capitalism, talking about colonialism. And we had that shared trust. And then from that shared trust came a space where we were able to have really critical conversations about race and also critical conversations about the strategies that were being employed by white people also within our political movements. And that was a huge point of political growth for me. So yeah, for me, like these like spaces of negotiation are really, really important in encountering like that shared humanity, right?
And I think it's also really important. I've found this a couple times. I have been in the scene, I've been having these thoughts for a while. And so if we go back to the example that my mom always said of like the pendulum swings back and forth, I needed that time of not speaking, of shutting up and listening. And like, it's very necessary. And so I'm just thinking, if some random person listens to us and goes, okay, white people need to be at the forefront of this. Yes, in a way that also makes sense and is helping the cause and is not just regurgitating this idea of white saviorism of
Yeah.
we need to do this because of other people. And I think that's where Emma Dabiri really shines, because she has this book.
Yeah.
It's called What White People Can Do Next. And it came out right after George Floyd at the height of Instagram activism. And she very clever. The front cover is like flowers and it's really cutesy and it looks very much like an Instagram infographic of, hey, the rise of Black Lives Matter is back on the, global stage. What should white people be doing about it? And she was just like, take a beat and realize that these structures are affecting all of us. We all live under this white supremacist culture.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think is so important about her work, and I always come back to it, is not losing the flavoring of how it affects people differently. Because there is a very common pitfall of, if we are all being affected by this, then we are suffering just as much as everyone else and we're all in this together. And that's not true. Because that leads to people saying, especially here in Germany, dreadlocks are a very big topic. And yeah, I know, I don't want to go in there either. But everyone's just like, well, why isn't it just a hairstyle that everyone can use? And why can't we just get to a point where that is like open and free and everyone can have access to it? And it's like, because you haven't realized the impact of all the people that are being discriminated against for it. You're using it, and then you're just saying, well, why don't we all get to just move forward without doing any accountability or repair work? We'll get into that next episode. But it's very important that we acknowledge that, and you don't just like get rid of that whole history and say, yeah, well, the goal is that we can all talk about it and that we can all have dreadlocks and that we can all do this. Therefore, let's just do that. You need to go through the accountability and repair work first before you can have a meaningful output that you can work with.
This is really real, right? Like, because I also think about that. I'm like, if someone just tunes in, they're going to be like, oh, well, we're saying that we're colorblind. We are not saying that we're colorblind. Oh, they're saying that white supremacy affects everyone the same. No, we're definitely not saying that. Making a huge distinction between the material violence that is exerted upon Black and brown people. Like, this is real. Like, there is not a single part of us that would ever deny that. We're trying to make an argument for the fact that that same structure causes immense spiritual damage to us. Like, it causes damage to our humanity as white people. And that's why I think like it's so important to speak to white people about this and also speak from a perspective of like, when we dehumanize another person, we are dehumanizing ourselves. When we hurt another person, we are hurting ourselves. And like to recognize that, right? Because that allows us to have and to build these coalitions from that space of, you are experiencing it differently than me. We both have a stake in this and we can work alongside each other to negotiate our political strategy. And actually, like even Frantz Fanon said it, right? The same article. This was a great article. We will link it. Obviously, it's open access, which is amazing. But so in this article, the Black philosopher Frantz Fanon, born in French Martinique, was one of the pioneers in the issue of white racial identity, advocating the need to free white people from their whiteness and Black people from their Blackness so that every person may fully enjoy their human condition. So this is what we're trying to, like, I think this summarizes it so perfectly, right? This is what we're trying to talk about. It's not they are the same. It's not the freedom is that, but it's actually about like, how do we look at these structures and start to completely break them down so that we can all appreciate our shared humanity.
I think if someone's having a hard time wrapping their mind around this, just think about the like 2010s of feminism, which was just explaining to men how the patriarchy hurts them, where it was just this idea of, if you are enacting violence to someone, you're enacting that same violence to yourself. If you are just like filled with this feeling of that women are emotional and it's weak to have emotions, all of those ideas, when you internalize them, mean that men, patriarchal men, cannot have access to their emotions and are causing themselves a lot of damage in that way. And I think that's the same of if we dehumanize everyone, the global majority of people, and say that you deserve to live in poverty, you deserve to have the climate disaster on your doorstep. The only way that you can grapple with that in your mind is if you have cut off all empathy, right? Going back to the article at the beginning. If you are working in healthcare and you see all this suffering, but you're like, got to get stuff done, you're going to block that empathy off. And this is, I feel like we've just come to fruition of that. It's been hundreds of years of us living off of the societal model. And now here we are in a world that we're constantly, we have rampant addiction. We have the male loneliness epidemic is not just for men. It's kind of everyone is cut off from touch, cut off from love, cut off from community support. And everyone wonders why we all spend our evenings just watching Netflix and eating takeout. It's like we don't have that love of life anymore. Yeah.
So I think this is like a nice segue into more of the ways that white supremacy actually screws us as white people over, and why we should have like a full-bodied solidarity that comes from understanding that our plight is tied up with the plight of other people. So one thing that I like that you said, like, is this like idea of, that we look around us and it's like, well, it's fine if that happens to you, but it's not happening to me. So there's a flip side to this, right? And this flip side is one that I deeply explored right after October 7th, which was basically everyone was just kind of asking everyone to be like, oh, but you condemn the Hamas attack, right? And it was kind of like, well, I'm not really interested in talking about that. Like, I'm more interested in talking about the nearly 100 years of violent settler colonialism that has happened there. Unless you're going to come out, right, and open your conversation with, I condemn the US empire, I condemn the European empire, I condemn all forms of global capitalism that exploit people of the global majority, then why should I have to say something about this? And I think one of the reasons that people were so weird, in at least like around me, that I saw people like really got really uncomfortable about October 7th was this idea of like, even if in theory, like afterwards they were like, yes, Palestinian resistance and no to the genocide, the act of the Palestinian people rising up in an organized armed revolution was a direct threat to the reflection of themselves that they saw in Israel, right? So a direct threat of this like solidarity with whiteness, right? Solidarity with Judeo-Christian culture, with like this feeling of like they are like us and they are under attack. Even if I could morally recognize that the genocide that's happening is terrible, I have to condemn this attack, because if I do not, I'm living with this dissonance, like this cognitive dissonance of like, oh, but like those are people who look like me that got killed. And for me, it was really like, well, if I'm identifying with the people who are rising up, right? Because fair enough. Like, you are under violent oppression. And so it's like, if we're going to keep taking other people's territory, if we're going to keep taking other people, like at some point, the jig is up and something is going to happen. Like, that's just how it is. And so for me, it was like, I don't see why I have to condemn that if I'm also like understanding like that's a logical conclusion after all of these years of horrific violence taking place. And so like I thought that was a really interesting thing. And then I kind of started to extrapolate this to the larger context of like, what would it mean to have more revolutions in the global south? And how would that threaten kind of like white people's position as hegemonic? And what does it mean to identify our humanity with the humanity of folks in the global south, right? Because that's not a threat to me if I identify that my humanity is tied up with their humanity. Then it's actually something that I'm like, go, bring down the system, right? Bring down the oppressors, because I identify with them. So it creates a safer life for me, actually. Or like, ideologically, it creates a safer life in the sense of just being able to identify, okay, so if this happens, right, I know my politic. I know that I'm a liberationist. And that's what's important to me. So I will identify with those who are doing liberatory work.
Thank you for saying that, because I think it's so important that we really think about who we are and what side we're on when it comes to these really global issues. And I think if you look back at the origins of the term white and the term black as applied to people, it is literally a tool that was used to divide those who could stand in solidarity and say, oh, we are all being oppressed here. Why don't we band together to rise up? You can look at Bacon's Rebellion if you want to look more into that. And I think if you apply that to the Israel-Palestine genocide, who do you resonate with and where are your allegiances? If you see yourself as part of the ruling class, if you see yourself as white and therefore inherently deserving of land and resources at the cost of the global majority, then of course I can understand why you're supporting Israel. But if you see yourself as part of the people who are currently being torn apart from their siblings across the globe, of those who are also resisting and standing up to these structures, if you see yourself as part of that, then it is without a doubt that you're going to be supporting Palestine and saying, those are people who have such severe suffering over the last almost 100 years, such severe suffering that they have finally managed to come up and have an armed resistance, something that I am desperate for those of us in Germany and the US and the Netherlands to also do. Why would we not be supporting them? Why would we not do everything in our power to stop the weapons from getting to Israel?
If it were not for our identification with whiteness, right? And then I think like what's interesting is just because we identify with those struggles and we identify with a specific part of those struggles does not mean that we can't also be critical of like what happens in those struggles. So like, because there's the idea of like, this kind of tanky idea of like, oh well, if you're a Maoist and you recognize like all of the amazing things that Mao did for China, because objectively, like, I'm sorry, China like shot up in terms of quality of life, like an amazing feat. That does not kind of scrub away all of like the really fucked up things that happened and like the deaths of so many people, right? And this can all be true at the same time. But I think like it's really about, do we perceive a revolutionary force as a threat and why? And if we see it as a threat to us, it's usually because we're identifying, exactly as you say, with the ruling class. And we have like these hidden loyalties to structures that fundamentally are built on oppression. And so it's like, if we're going to be liberationists, like, I think it's really important that we find those and we interrogate them. And we're really like, this is not who I'm trying to be. Like, I'm trying to build a humanity where I recognize interdependence, like from that nice quote from that article that I liked so much.
And what is your definition of liberationist?
So I would say my definition of a liberationist is really like close to this article, right? So like this idea of reciprocal recognition. So it's like recognizing yourself and everyone else and recognizing that everyone is deserving of dignity, rights, knowledge, social projects, and life. Life being a very, very important one because we see a consistent, like, oh, this life is not worth as much as this other life. But it's like when we recognize ourselves and everyone else, then we can recognize everyone has autonomy to like live a certain way. So even if someone is living in a way that I wouldn't necessarily choose for myself, I'm like, all right, well, are you harming like people, animal, planet, the ecology around us? No? Cool. Well, then do your vibe, right? Like I have no beef with people who are not just trying to live their life in a way that resonates with their own cultural values. So I think like that's what being a liberationist for me means, is like ridding ourselves of like these structures that force us to live our lives in a specific way according to a specific norm. And yeah, don't recognize like our fundamental autonomy as cultures, as people, as communities, that don't let us live that.
Yeah. And I think it's why consent is such a beautiful practice. I recently was being asked about my definition of consent, and I realized I'm so deep in that I don't even think about it in relation to sex anymore. I'm like, no, consent is an approach to life where you are careful about not like pushing things under the rug or trying to hide your imperfections or anything, but just being so open and saying, hey, this is me in all my messy humanity. These are the things I want in life. These are the things that I tend to avoid sitting with the discomfort of saying, oh, what you're doing right now is not something that aligns with me and is not something that I want in my life right now. How can we work together to create something that fits for everyone who's involved? And that can go from making dinner with someone to the global revolution. All of it, I find I really resonate with the practice of how can we really truly understand consensual relationships as the core of that.
Yeah, and so I really agree with this idea of like looking at consent. And also, this is one of the things that I think white supremacy robs us of, and it robs us of it already. We talk about this in the origins of whiteness, right? Like this moment where we're looking at how were all of the cultural differences, right? Like the things that made you connect to your country, like your land, your territory, the other people who are from that same space, how were those erased to make space for like an extremely bland and empty category of white middle class culture, right? Which is essentially empty. And I think like one of the things that white supremacy is really robbed from us is in this construction of history as only being from the point of view of the oppressor, of the victorious, right? Is that it's actually robbed us entirely of our ability to identify with anyone who did not consent to the way that people were being treated. Because like I remember reading Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis and being like, I really wonder how the job of telling me which white women were doing good in the feminist struggle in the 1900s fell on the shoulders of a black woman who's writing about race and class, and she's the one who's identified here were some people who actually were doing this in conjunction with the civil rights movement. Here were some women, some white women who were actually interested in fighting for racial justice. And I was just like, yeah, why is this the first time that I'm reading something like this? Why are we not more, as white people, why are we not more invested in finding like our histories of dissidence, right? Finding our histories of people who oppose that stuff. People who say like critical race theory, oh, it's going to teach like our children to hate themselves. Yeah, if you only teach your children to identify with slaveholders, then yes, it's going to teach them to hate themselves if they realize how fucked up all of that was. Of course. But that's why you teach them to identify with people who were against slavery, right? Or people who stood up, people who did co-organizing, right? Because like you said, like I didn't hook onto this earlier, but you said this thing about that whiteness has been used as a way to like rip apart coalitions, right? There were coalitions of black and white folk, especially in the South, that were ripped apart by the introduction of whiteness as like the only axis of power available to working class white people, right? And I'm just like, why are we not being taught about these coalitions that existed? Why are we not being taught about how those were ripped apart? Why are we not being taught to identify with people who were fighting for love and justice and community and doing this active project of negotiating across racial lines and finding ways to do political strategy?
Like the White Panther Party. Can we all talk about the fact that the Black Panther Party is so well known and no one talks about the White Panther Party? There was a group of white people who approached the Black Panther Party and said, what can we as white people do? And they said, start your own coalition. Let's work together. But, like, we're doing our thing right now. And the White Panther Party and the Black Panther Party worked together really intensely. And they were also super committed to being anti racist and to bring that politic into their work. And yet they haven't stood the test of time of history.
And on this, like because I think the Black Panthers were so amazing. And speaking of like finding these ways to connect our struggles, right? The Black Panther Party paired with the Young Patriot Organization. So this is like from Hillbilly Harlem, which was a neighborhood in Chicago, and it was mostly displaced white Southern folks. Right. So a lot of them were really racist, like the Young Patriot Organization. A lot of them were racist. They even had like a Confederate flag as the symbol of their organization. And so Fred Hampton reached out to them still because they were poor. These were poor people. And Fred Hampton was trying to build the Rainbow Coalition. And from there, they kind of start to attend each other's meetings. They decide to work together on their common issues. And at some point, not because the Black Panther Party told them to, but because they realized themselves that the Confederate flag was a symbol of racist oppression, the YPO decided to stop using that symbolism because they recognized like, oh, we're actually like working really closely with these people and like we're we're fighting the same fight. So why would we keep using this, right? This, like the story of like the queer people in the UK and the miners, right? Like the
I
miners
was
who were
just
like
thinking about
really
that.
gay, like from the movie Pride. This is the work. That's what we need to be doing. That's
Just
it.
global solidarity, recognize. And it's so interesting. Sorry, I just had this thought. It's so interesting that in a lot of white feminism, in a lot of ways that white people embody space, they paint themselves as the victim. And it's a
Mm.
lot of self victimization and like, oh no, look at me, I'm having such a rough time. And it gets called out all the time because they're usually in a position of power while they are claiming to be the victim. But just take it one step further. Think about the ways that you actually are suffering.
Mm.
Really truly think about it and not victimize yourself, but just go, oh shit, the things that I thought were the issue, marginalized people, people that we are actively oppressing, they are not the ones who are going to turn around and do the same thing to you. I think that that is the underlying fear. We have spent centuries literally oppressing, putting people down, and saying, okay, you do not deserve to have any sense of humanity. And the terror there is that if they get any power, they're going to do the same to us.
Yeah.
And that is not, I just don't see that happening. What I see happening is a universal recognition that we are all humans. And I think that why a lot of people of color have that for white people is because they grew up watching movies about us falling in love and reading poetry and stories about our lives and the
Yeah.
intricate details of our lives. And so they have no problem recognizing our humanity, seeing the ways that we fucked up, and still seeing us as human beings. And the fact that there is a lack of cultural phenomena in the world of Black authors, movies, they exist, they're out there, they're wonderful, they're amazing, but they're not marketed as for the masses. It's like you have to go to a
It's not
niche art
mainstream.
house. And I think this is something that Emma Dabiri hammers down in her book, saying, read stories written by people that are different from you and read fiction. Don't read nonfiction like stats and figures, but really see the humanity in them. See what is
Mm-hmm.
happening in their inner worlds, in their lives. What does their love look like? When I read The Hate You Give, Thug, great book, about a person being killed by the police and their best friend having to navigate the Black neighborhood in which they live and the white school in which they attend, and like these different realities. And it just hammered down the point of it doesn't matter what the person who was shot by the police did. What matters is that the police killed someone, and that is never okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that, but reading this story, it gripped your heart, it grips your soul, it puts it into your body in a way that reading nonfiction doesn't always work like that.
Yeah.
There's just so much power in stories.
Yeah, I agree. And so one of the things that I think of immediately is like the process of world making, right? Like, and I think fiction theory has a lot of overlap with our political work. I was recently talking about this with one of my friends where we were discussing kind of like this place of how does reading fiction and practicing stepping into a world that is not our own, with our minds open, with our eyes open, our ears open, like all of our senses are open to discovering like this new world, even though things might not make sense, we're open to it, right? And so how can that teach us like a way of stepping into other worlds in our everyday reality from a place of really openness and curiosity and love, right? And understanding that maybe we're not going to get it right. Maybe we don't understand certain things, but like I was thinking about this because I was reading a book, a fiction book, where it just kind of drops you in the middle of the story. And there's like all of this weird stuff happening. So there are all of these rules, like literally like physics rules of this world that you're stepping into that you do not understand for the first like 100 pages of this book. But I was reading it and I was like, oh, I don't really understand what's going on, but like, let's find out, right? Like, let's keep reading. Let's be interested. Let's be curious. And it's like when we use that perspective, that same perspective of fiction reading in our everyday lives, like when we have different cultural exchanges, I think like that's a really beautiful starting point because then we have curiosity. And that's from that curiosity, we have access to like, because this is another thing where I think white supremacy really like screws us over as white people. How much knowledge, how much culture, how many perspectives have been erased from us, how many amazing people do we not get to meet because we live in segregated society, right? How much music do we not get the chance to listen to? How many different worldviews are there that are just immediately said like, oh, well, it's not good. Like, well, I mean, we're hurtling towards the climate crisis because of our worldview. So I'm trying to find a different thing to do, right? So, like, with that openness, with that curiosity, and with like the refusal to participate in white supremacy, we're also opening up huge amounts of knowledge for ourselves, which is amazing. Like, what a gift.
Yeah. Our commitment to racial justice is a healing practice for all aspects of our lives.
Exactly. Just to finish up, like, I think like a little summary, right? Like, so, you know, we see white supremacy and white supremacy culture not only like dehumanizing materially through material violence, through extractivism, through like all of this horrible stuff that happens, people of the global majority, but they also dehumanize us as white people through the construction of a norm, like a norm of personality, a norm of humanness, which is actually just anti-human. And so like this denies us so much like possibility of connection. It denies us possibility of new ways of understanding, of new knowledge, of different kinds of relationships, of different kinds of positioning ourselves in the world. And so like that for me is why I think like I will always be trying to construct this critical whiteness. I will always try to construct my humanity off of an understanding that I'm interdependent with other people.
Yeah. And we want to change the structures in society. We don't want to just focus on me, myself, and I.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, the structures are built off of human interactions and human choices. And
Yeah.
so it is so important that while we don't end with the self, we certainly start with the self and say, how do we have these alliances to whiteness? How can we become white traitors, betray the capitalist system that has gotten us this far, and learn to just love and dance and listen to music and read stories? Free yourself from these
Yeah.
shackles and then put it all into practice and start to live in a way as if we are all interconnected and see what happens.
Yeah.
I find that just taking that first step already has improved my life in so many different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, like Fanon says, right, this idea of like we need to deconstruct these things so that we can each enjoy like our full human condition.
It's worth it.
It is.
It's hard work and it really cuts deep into your core
Yeah.
about everything you have ever been taught, but it's worth it.
Thank you for listening to Pieces.
You can find us on Patreon through the show notes, where we would love to hear what resonated with you, where your questions were, and what you would like us to expand upon.
So we hope this has some moments of learning for you, and we hope you tune in for our next conversations.
Next time on Pieces, we'll be discussing conflict and accountability through the lens of white supremacy culture. See you then.
See you then. Bye. Cool. I am terrified about what I just said, by the way. So I need to like, I'm going to need to check that like 10 times before we put it online because I'm like, ooh,
Yeah.
That's going to get me some fucking hate.
Yeah, it is.
Cool.
I'm with you, Bubby. To the end.